Hello and welcome to Track Changes. At a speech I went to a few weeks ago, Australia's Climate Minister Chris Bowen told the audience that it was remarkable how much community support there is for the transition, the energy transition, the clean economy transition, given the disinformation against it. The minister went on to tell the conference that the vitriol directed at him on social media far exceeds anything received by any other government minister. And he said that when he talks to climate change ministers in other jurisdictions and in other countries, they tell him they have the same experience. It's an experience that a lot of people will be familiar with. Climate scientists, activists, and basically anyone who is involved in climate action, especially the many heroes of the climate action movement. So why is social media so full of trolls and bots, as well as genuinely misinformed, angry people? Well, in Australia, the UK and the US, it's due in large part to the Murdoch media, an organisation that is like one great big troll farm, spreading lies about climate change and climate action. But there are other reasons as well, and there's an important new book out that looks at these other reasons and examines what can be done about them. We're going to hear from one of the editors and two of the contributors to that book shortly. But first, I just want to do a quick roundup of what's being done to tackle climate disinformation and misinformation, because there are some significant actions underway. First up, at the international level, Brazil, as host of the COP30 climate talks that will be held soon, has actually appointed an envoy for the digital world who is focusing on high-profile measures to fight climate misinformation. Brazil is also one of the backers of a global initiative for information integrity on climate change, which was launched last year by UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. The UN itself will in a few days host a session on climate change information integrity at a special high-level event on climate action in New York. There are also some attempts underway in Australia to get a better grip on the extent and spread of misinformation and disinformation. Most importantly, a few months ago, the Australian Senate started up a new inquiry into climate and energy information integrity. The inquiry will look at issues including the prevalence of misinformation and disinformation. It will also examine who is financing and producing it. One more thing before we go to the chat. It's crucial to remember that not every social media critic of climate action is malevolent and out to mislead. Many people are genuinely concerned about change and about economic impact. And while you'll hear today's panel talk about the spread of solutions misinformation as a way of slowing action, which is a real and growing problem, there are also legitimate disagreements about some potential solutions. All these issues have to be talked through. Unfortunately, they now often have to be talked through against a backdrop of deliberate lies. Okay, let's hear what our panel has to say. We're going to hear from Timmons Roberts, Melissa Aronczyk, and John Cook. All three have contributed to this major new book on climate disinformation, which is called Climate Obstruction, a Global Assessment, and which is available from Oxford University Press. Timmons is one of the editors, and Melissa and John are contributors. One more thing, just before we go to the chat, if you like this episode, don't forget to rate it on your favourite podcast app. Now for the chat. Melissa, Timmons, John, welcome to Track Changes.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
So I have a standard question that I like to ask all guests, and it's this. Could you tell me briefly about your work, particularly your work in climate change and sustainability? And can you give me a career highlight so far? So maybe, Melissa, do you want to kick off on that one?
Absolutely. I'm a professor of media studies at Rutgers University in the United States. My research looks at the professional consultants and political strategists who work on climate change and climate obstruction. That includes public relations professionals, ad agencies, lobbyists, and other strategic communicators in both corporate settings and also in government contexts. So yeah, my career highlight is actually the response I got to my latest book, which is called A Strategic Nature. It's published by Oxford University Press and co-authored with Maria Espinoza. The book came out in 2022, and there was a groundswell of attention being paid to this problem of how strategists have become so powerful in shaping the way we understand what environmental problems are and how to solve them.
Yeah, a very important topic to cover. Timmons, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Murray. It's good to be on. So I'm going to do this a little more biographically. That is, in 1992, I started researching climate change, especially on trying to apply a theory from sociology called world systems theory, and to apply that and the methods that have been used in sort of transnational research to understand how inequality works in terms of climate change impacts, who's responsible, and who's actually doing anything about it. And so that work went on for decades. I went to the UNFCCC, the big climate change negotiations, for about 15 years, from 2003 to 2017. And then our president, Donald Trump, in his first term, withdrew from the Paris Agreement, which my students and I had watched and tried to participate in the drafting of that. So I said, wait a minute, we've just got to bring the troops back home. I had a delegation of 18 people in Bonn, Germany, and I said, what are we doing over here? So we went back to Washington, D.C. and worked on obstruction on climate change action in the United States. And I had always been working locally when I lived in New Orleans, in coastal Virginia, and then here in Rhode Island. And in Rhode Island, it's such a small little state that really one of my career highlights that was working with my students to pass science-based targets in something called the Resilient Rhode Island Act in 2014, and to help also another bill get passed in 2021 called the Act on Climate. And between that was 5 years of frustration having our bills die in committees. That is, led me to realize that the state level was really important in who's obstructing action on climate change in the U.S. And so I mobilized my lab to work on that.
But just to clarify, you got a science-based targets bill up in 2014 before the Paris Agreement, did you say?
That's right, yes.
Wow.
But it was not binding, so it took another 7 years to get a binding
but
law.
Still, that's an extraordinary achievement. And now, John, over to you. A brief bit of background and a career highlight.
Yeah, thanks, Murray. So I'm a cognitive scientist, which means I do psychology research at the University of Melbourne. And my research is focused on climate misinformation from a psychology perspective. So part of that is doing running psychological experiments, testing the impacts or how misinformation does damage. But mostly I'm focused on what are ways that we can push back, counter misinformation. So it's about designing interventions that can try to debunk misinformation, or even better, pre-bunk misinformation, and then actually trying to put those into practice. But I would say that to answer your second question in terms of a career highlight, about halfway through my PhD, I had no idea that this was going to be a highlight at the time, but in 2013, we published a paper. So this is 2 years into my PhD, where we just did a fairly modest study, not even really very novel, like other studies had done similar things, but we were just trying to quantify how much scientific agreement there was on human-caused global warming. And we found that there was 97% consensus. Just coincidentally, our study came out just a few weeks before the Obama administration were about to start unrolling climate policy. And so Obama tweeted about the study, highlighted it in his launch speech where he first introduced the policy. And the attention that he brought to the study then unleashed a wave of attention, initially positive, but then there was a lot of criticism of the study from climate deniers who did not like the message that there was overwhelming scientific agreement amongst climate scientists.
I love that story. Wow, there would be a lot of PhD students out there very jealous that President Obama tweeted about their work. That's an extraordinary achievement, well, an extraordinary highlight and a great field of study to be focusing on. So I'm going to present a statement and I want each of you to tell me if I'm right or wrong. No need for praise, criticism, praise. Just tell me whether I'm right or wrong and why. And the statement is this: we've always had deniers, misinformers, and disinformers. What's happening now is no different from what's happened before. We should just ignore them because there aren't many of them. And the vast bulk of people are at least open to climate action. So, Melissa, over to you first. What do you think of my statement? Am I right or wrong?
I think you're mostly right about the first part of that statement and mostly wrong about the second part.
Melissa.
What's happening now with climate deniers and misinformers has a very long history. And I think it's important to remember that. Since the early 20th century, environmental concerns have been a thorn in the side of heavy industry and industrial expansion. And I'd even argue that the whole business of publicity, using the media to shape the public's understanding, grew up around the need for business to control its image around environmental problems. And for a long time, business succeeded. For instance, you picture the familiar visual of smokestacks on the horizon. That used to be looked at as a sign of progress and not a sign of polluted air. But the second part of your statement, that we should just ignore them, is precisely what business climate deniers want and what they've spent decades trying to uphold. I think climate denial works not just by actively saying climate change isn't happening, but also by changing the channel, reframing the problem, or offering so-called solutions to the climate crisis, which are really just solutions that work for the people articulating the problem. So my job as a researcher is to show what these deniers are really up to. For example, showing how the solutions they propose are really just solutions for themselves and not about helping to mitigate the effects of climate change.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So partly right, partly wrong. Timmons, what's your take?
Yeah, I had a right wrong as well for you. That is,
Okay.
these guys, they've always existed, but they used to be in pretty isolated places without a huge ability to control the, wider understanding. But I think now it's the social media and Fox and other right-wing media that has really multiplied their impact. And they're seeking and they're succeeding at creating this impression of widespread skepticism about climate change impacts, but especially about the viability of the solutions. So it cannot be ignored anymore. And in fact, in the case that I work on a lot, which is opposition to offshore wind, a lot of the wind developers, environmentalists, policymakers, and so on thought that they could ignore the naysayers, and it's really backfired that there's a result of use of right-wing media and social media, especially these just really exaggerated, spectacular, sensationalized claims have spread.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Now over to you, John. Your take on my statement.
Yeah, a way to make misinformation effective is to seed facts within the myths. And so you could say that, like what Melissa and Timmons were saying about there being true and false statements in your statement. Yeah, some of it was true, but some of it was also false. And I think everything that Melissa and Timmons said, I agree with. And certainly climate solutions is a growing part of the misinformation landscape. Climate misinformation has been transitioning steadily for the last few decades away from science denial and more towards solutions misinformation. But we've also published research, a couple of studies actually, that find that not only that trend of a transition towards solutions misinformation, but also attacking climate science and scientists themselves is a very big chunk of the climate misinformation landscape. particularly on social media, where it's like more than half of climate misinformation on social media is just attacks on the science, trying to undermine the credibility of climate science itself. And that's been with us for several decades as a form of climate misinformation. But things have dramatically changed just over the last 6 months. Yeah, at least in the US, with the Trump administration now escalating the attack on climate science. So it's not just arguments that you can't trust climate models or you can't trust scientists. They're now actually dismantling climate science and shutting down websites, trying to shut down even data collection. And so that's taking climate obstruction to a whole other level.
Yeah. I mean, the attacks on scientists is crystal clear, depressingly crystal clear, the meaning of that. Tell me what you mean by solutions disinformation.
Yeah. So, in 2021, I published a study with some colleagues in the UK and Ireland where we documented the different categories of climate misinformation. There's 5 categories. The first 3 are the science-based arguments or anti-science-based arguments. Global warming is not real. It's not caused by humans. It's not bad. The 4th category is any misinformation targeting climate solutions. And the most common category within those was arguing that climate solutions such as policy to reduce emissions are harmful. In other words, they increase prices, they make it harder for people. And this was back in 2021 when we published this study. Since then, it was actually Timmons was part of a later study that went much deeper into different types of solutions misinformation. And he could explain it better, but they call them discourses of delay. And there's a whole range of different arguments and framings that are really about trying to delay climate action.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a depressing answer, but sounds, yes, it's sadly rings very true. Timmons, back to you. Can you tell me about the genesis of the book? It's called Climate Obstruction. How do you define climate obstruction?
Right. So the book is called Climate Obstruction, A Global Assessment. And we define climate obstruction as intentional actions and efforts to slow or block policies on climate change that are commensurate with the current scientific consensus of what's necessary to avoid dangerous anthropogenic, meaning human-caused, interference in the climate system. So intentional efforts to block action on climate is my usual short definition. And the book grew out of this new organization that we've built over the last about 5.5 years called the Climate Social Science Network. Robert Bruhl, who was at Drexel University and is now at Brown University, and I were the leaders in starting this. And we were thinking we would have 30 or 50 people. Well, we're now over 800 scholars in 49 countries.
Wow.
And it's growing at like 35% in the last year. We're growing fast. We'd have working groups on all kinds of topics, including what we're talking about here with sort of greenwashing and the more media-focused groups. And we have groups on industry, different sectors, and on right-wing think tanks, and on legal approaches and so on. We have also give out sub-grants, and we've given out now 108 sort of seed grants for research teams all over the world to get started in researching in this area. And we do programs and conferences and these kind of publications. So our theory of change in the group, in the Climate Social Science Network, is that we need to understand the opposition to climate action. That those, who are seeking to stop climate action have been so successful because, in large part because environmentalists, policymakers, and others who wanted to see climate action were quite naive that they would just get out of the way when they were made aware of these great, the importance of the science and the great technology and policy tools. But they have not, because they have a vested interest. They are interested in maintaining the status quo. And there's also just a lot of sort of inertia in the system that makes it quite hard to to move. So last year we put out a book which was kind of similar, called Climate Obstruction Across Europe, with Bob Brule and Miranda Spencer. And there we had 11 case studies of European countries and one about the European level. This time, as lead editor, I recruited 3 great scholars, leaders in Climate Social Science Network. That is Jennifer Jacquet, whose focus a lot is on agriculture and how that sector has avoided, especially animal agriculture, has avoided attention to their climate impact. Christian Downey, who's there in Australia and really knows the case and knows Asia well, and also has worked in the United States on business associations and chambers of commerce and so on. Carlos Milani in Brazil is the 4th co-editor, and he's a political scientist and leads one of our Global South working groups in CSSN. So then we chose together, the 4 of us, 27 lead authors who on these 13 chapters, and they in turn recruited 3 to 8 contributing authors each. And what we consider this as sort of like an IPCC, an Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, assessment volume. We're trying to assess what is the state of knowledge and where are the areas that research is needed in the future. We have chapters about the oil and gas industry, coal, steel, and railroads, utilities, about agriculture, the far right, religious organizations, think tanks, PR firms, the media, public opinion, and the global South, subnational efforts to block climate action, the UN negotiations, obstructing resilience efforts, which remarkably is happening as well, but has been very little studied. And then legal and state efforts to address this, and how social movements are responding. So it is a wide-ranging book, and I think it really advances the science quite substantially, massively. I'll go ahead and say it, massively.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I love that analogy to the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is scientists, the scientists who examine climate change. Or yours is sort of more like an inter-academic panel on climate communication, a sort of a different form of IPCC. John, I'm going to come over to you, because you're the lead author on one chapter, which seems slightly different to most of the others, in that it's not about the creators and sharers of disinformation. It's about the consumers. So tell me some of the key findings of your chapter that you think are particularly significant.
Yeah, so we were looking, and Timmons mentioned public opinion as one of the topics. So we were assigned the chapter on public opinion, and I brought to it my psychological discipline. So we were looking at what are the psychological drivers of climate misinformation and climate denial, and what impact does misinformation have on people, and also how do they misinform? Like, what are the different arguments and what are the different rhetorical techniques used in misinformation? And so, what did we find? We found a lot to boil it down. But the thing because a lot of it was summarizing the research that I'm very familiar with, but the thing that actually not surprised me, but really jumped out at me was, and I think this is the power of this volume, was bringing a more global perspective. One of the flaws, if you could say, of climate misinformation research has been that it has been very global north in its focus. It tends to be even just North America and US focused, and guilty as charged. A lot of my research has been like that as well, very US focused or Australia focused. And so it was great that Timmons and the Climate Social Science Network has brought together all these academics working on this topic from all over the world. And in our chapter, we had a colleague from Brazil who brought his perspective of how climate misinformation manifests in Brazil. And what fascinated me about it was the overall patterns were the same, but they had this unique local angle. And I'll just give you 2 examples. One was that, and we've already talked about how solutions misinformation or just misinformation targeting policy is is such a key element to climate obstruction. The version of it in like the US and a lot of the Western countries has been, it's about deregulation. It's about arguing that government shouldn't be regulating the fossil fuel industry. And it's a general philosophy. But how that deregulation argument manifests in Brazil is it's all around deforestation rather than about fossil fuel emissions. And so it was the same themes, but just manifesting in a different way. The other interesting aspect was, and I mentioned earlier that attacking climate science and trying to undermine the credibility of climate science is also a big category of climate misinformation. Conspiracy theories are a big part of that. It's about saying that you can't trust climate scientists because they're all conspiring to deceive the public. The way that conspiracy theories manifest in Brazil is more about how the Western countries are conspiring against Brazil. And so it's but putting a climate spin on it. So it's just interesting to see that those same themes emerge, but with a different local angle.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And just to be clear, I think the context for what he was talking about is the Bolsonaro regime, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it was describing just how Bolsonaro's government and specific ministers within his government were quite prolific sources of misinformation.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. Over to you, Melissa, because now you're a lead author on one chapter, which has a very broad remit in that it talks about legacy news, social media, advertisers, and PR. Tell me about some of the key, exactly. quite an ambitious scope there, Melissa. Tell me about some of the key findings of your chapter that you think are particularly significant or important for us to understand in order to make progress.
Yeah. So yes, in our chapter, we're trying to explain how the fossil fuel industry actively works with legacy news, and by legacy news, I mean media like television, newspapers, and radio, as well as social media platforms to promote disinformation that interferes with climate action and climate policy. And I think what draws all of those seemingly disparate media together is that there is truly a network of media disinformation, and that's really the main focus of the chapter. So we show how public relations and advertising are deployed by the fossil fuel industry, sometimes directly through the news media and through technology companies and platforms, to set the agenda and to uphold fossil fuel perspectives about climate change in the media. I think one of the key takeaway for our readers in that chapter was to help people remember that since our commercial media system and much of the internet is underwritten by corporate sponsors, much of the mainstream coverage of the climate crisis is going to be affected. It's so difficult and so important for individuals to find sources of information that can undo climate myths and help us think clearly.
Can I ask you there? I mean, it is true. It's absolutely true what you're saying, that the legacy media is underwritten by corporate interests. But I guess the thing that comes to mind is, well, does that push people then to forms of media which are far less rigorous in a way? So there's an upside and a downside to relying on legacy media, isn't there? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, that's a very complex question. For a long time, journalists, the norm, let's say, or the professional training of journalists is, of course, to have different perspectives on an issue that they bring to a story. And for a long time, unfortunately, because corporate interests were so powerful and did so much agenda setting with media and source building and expert building and so on, when journalists would go to get perspectives on climate change, they would always include a business or fossil fuel industry perspective. And for decades, that was incredibly problematic because you would have the perspective of the like John mentioned, the 97% consensus, and then you would have the perspective of the 3% non-consensus. And right, that really didn't do any favors to those trying to advance the argument that climate change was not only real, but in need of urgent attention. Now, I would say the landscape is different. You have journalists much, much more attuned to the problems, much more aware of the science because the science itself has become more mainstream. And of course, also the problem of climate change has become much more in people's backyards. We're much more aware of the problem through the unfortunate realities that it's brought us, whether that's extreme weather or otherwise. But now we have a different problem, which is that legacy media is suffering. It's dying out. So when our current existing mainstream media or trustworthy sources are also fighting for their own survival, unfortunately, what you see is their return to corporate sponsors. So, for instance, you have some of the major media outlets in the United States with their own in-house brand studios, basically marketing content development arms, and they will work with fossil fuel companies to develop content. And even though that's sponsored content and it's supposed to be labeled as such, it's often very difficult for readers, for media consumers, to tell the difference between the journalistic reporting and the sponsored or branded content.
Yes, it's certainly true that legacy media is struggling. That's for sure. And yeah, that problem of branded content is something that we've certainly seen in Australia, where the gas industry, for example, has sponsored a series in the Murdoch media. No surprise to anyone there. Timmons, I'm going to come back to you. Tell us about your introduction to the book and maybe highlight a couple of the 10 key findings that are in that introduction that you think are particularly important.
Yeah, thanks, Murray. It was quite difficult to summarize the amount of findings that are in this book. But we did our best, and I think what we do in the intro is just try to lay out the basic idea of obstruction, how it's defined, why it's important, who the main actors are, their tactics, and then we boil things down. And I'll just point out three things. I would say the biggest finding is that there are just so many actors. And in addition to, as John said, the narrow literature that we have on climate obstruction historically has been about the United States, especially, but it's also been on the oil and gas industry, and very little even on gas. I mean, it's almost all about oil, the big oil majors, and there are so many other actors, other industries that are upstream and downstream, but also in construction, transportation, utilities. There are trade associations, chambers of commerce, think tanks, PR firms, financial institutions, governments, and so on. So it goes up and down. So that's the big finding to me is really how many actors there are.
Yes.
And I guess I would say, given that, it's remarkable that anything gets done at all on climate change. These are actors that really are just at the core of our society's power structures. And, as the oil and gas industry itself is the most powerful industry in human history. So it's a tough factor. So I'll keep going with number 2 would be what John has already spoken about, that climate obstruction discourses are no longer just about denial of the reality of climate change. Rather, they're attacking the solutions. So a third thing I would say is that resistance is possible. It does come out in the book that there have been some successful efforts, from social movement campaigns to shame, public relations firms or corporations, to litigation efforts. There's, over 2,000 climate lawsuits around the world. Some of them are having big impacts, and even some good regulations in the European Union, for example, on greenwashing and so on. So there are some successes that people don't hear about very often. So we want to make sure to point out those as well.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned name and shame. Journalists love name and shame media releases and so on, because it does make for a great story. Okay, I'm going to ask you now, each of you, this book is obviously, it's an extraordinary act of scholarship and collaboration. Can you each tell me something that you learnt about climate obstructionism as a result of contributing to the book and of working with these other people. John, you touched on this to some extent. I'm not sure. Did you want to add anything else about that?
Yeah, I think I kind of put my finger on the key things that I learned from it. Just the similarities but differences in climate obstruction in different parts of the world.
Okay, thanks, John. Melissa.
It's so funny. My learning item, the thing that really struck me the most about working on this chapter, is more or less exactly what John said. The authors who contributed to our chapter were from the US, Canada, the UK, and Brazil. And one thing that became very clear to us as we developed our argument is that media systems are also very different from one country to the next. Media conglomerates work differently in different countries. They're governed by different rules. Social media companies also operate by different rules in different settings. So one thing that occurred to us was that we really need to develop a greater awareness of, for example, internet governance protocols in different countries to help climate action planners to figure out how can we develop policies that regulate climate obstruction in the media in a way that is actually impactful and actually helps to move the needle. We know how we all access media, of course, from all over the world now, but we know much less about how our media systems fit in or do not fit in with the kinds of climate obstruction tactics that are taking place. I would have loved to have more collaborators on this chapter. Well, that's not entirely true. It's very challenging to collaborate with multiple authors.
Yes.
So on the one hand, there were 6 of us, and that was, many cooks in the kitchen. But on the other hand, I would love to hear more from authors from the Global South, even from East and Southeast Asia, about climate obstruction, because that is another discovery that we made in working on this chapter. There simply is not enough critical research produced on how climate obstruction works through the media in those regions of the world. And we just need a better global picture of climate obstruction in media.
Timmons, over to you, because you have, we have an overview of the book and the process that's sort of unique to yourself and the fellow lead editors of the book. So what was it that most surprised you?
Yeah, I guess I would say, as I mentioned earlier, that obstruction is everywhere and it can be countered. But it's just amazing that anything gets done at all. And in part because of this inertia. It's just so easy for obstructors to convince people to just keep living life the way they always have than it is for those seeking to protect future generations and asking people to actually give up something in the short term. It's a very unbalanced struggle that we're in here. And I think that's kind of the impression I have at the end of all this. Just last night, I was at a hearing about offshore wind in a coastal community here in Rhode Island in the United States. And 25 people, 24 people stood up and testified against a major farm that was 59 miles offshore, so entirely invisible, but they didn't want the cable to run through their town.
It is amazing.
So there was impassioned testimony, and the people saying, "I won't stand by as my town is ruined," and there was just vast amount of exaggerated claims about wind's impacts. So this stuff that we've been studying, it's right there, in every town in the country as we try to move away from fossil fuels, and it's quite tough. But 28 people spoke eloquently for the wind project. So, and I do think that it's going to be approved. So there is sort of local efforts moving forward. And I would say on the issues that John brought up, we are going to do, we hope, a volume on climate obstruction across the global south. And in that case, we hope to be able to support researchers for a bit longer time, not just for the writing, but also to do some of the research necessary to pull together really original research and data about how their economies work and who are the main obstructive actors, because there's not an existing literature for them to draw on.
Yes. I guess one thing that's always struck me is the language that obstructionists and those against climate action sometimes use. It's always struck me as annoying that it's those opposed to action that lay claim to phrases like conservation, but true conservation rather than environmental activism, when in fact it's actors like it's people like those who are putting together wind farm projects onshore or offshore, whatever, people like that who are really doing what constitutes conservation, which is trying to find a way to conserve our quality of life and to conserve a safe planet for future generations. Okay, so thanks very much for those comments. Now I'm going to turn to a sentence in the book that I was intrigued by, and I'm going to read it out, and then I'm going to ask each of you to comment. And the sentence is this. It says, policy makers, civil society actors and researchers should be aware of and facilitate the conditions that can convert actors from climate obstructionists to climate pioneers. So I'm going to ask each of you, what do you think are the conditions that need to be created for that to happen? Can obstructionists, either creators of climate disinformation or the consumers of it, can they become climate pioneers? I'm going to turn to you first. John, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I was hoping you would come to me last. I needed time to think about that. But let me have a crack at it. So, it's a real challenge. And my initial thought on it is that climate obstructionists, who I typically study, like people who are dismissive about climate science, they are some of the hardest people to change their minds, because their ideology, their identity, their social identity is all wrapped around their dismissiveness about climate change. And so that means that even if you present evidence for climate change, they don't trust that evidence. So often the evidence is either ineffective or can even be counterproductive. So for that reason, usually when a question I get asked a lot when I talk about climate misinformation is, how do you change the mind of your cranky uncle who's dismissive of climate science? And usually my answer is that that's usually not the most effective goal. We don't need to change the minds of everyone in society in order to get climate action. We just need to activate enough people. And so I'm going to kind of dodge your question and instead say that one of the most effective strategies we can do is not necessarily changing or converting climate obstructors, but it's more about activating the people who are convinced about climate change but aren't doing much or anything about it. And one of the simplest things that people can do is just start talking about it with their friends and family. There's a climate silence. People tend to not talk about it, and by just activating people, empowering them to talk about climate change, that can build the momentum, the social momentum we need for climate action.
Okay. Well, I'm going to say two things there, John. Yes, you did dodge my question, but you also gave an excellent answer. So thanks very much. Melissa, your thoughts?
Once again, I'm following John here. I was hoping that you just wouldn't ask me my thoughts on this question. Because, and maybe it's just the way you phrased it for us about, converting actors from climate obstructionists to climate pioneers. And, what I've been thinking a lot about lately, I have a teenage son, and I've been thinking about how his relationship to climate change and to the futures of his generation are so different from mine. So I'm increasingly hopeful, actually, about the emerging generation and how they are becoming climate pioneers. And it's unfortunate that they're kind of becoming climate pioneers because they don't have a choice. And I think, once again, the climate change it's not a future problem. It's here. It's right now. It's an incredible crisis. It poses unprecedented existential problems. And so that generation has a tremendous amount of anxiety about the future. But I think they also have some very important tools. And those tools include a sort of healthy distrust of industrial power and overreach, and an incredible, what I see is a very positive cynicism about things like advertising and certain kinds of messaging. Obviously, that can go into very different directions, and some of those directions have been very troubling and need attention. But when I look at it from the point of view of climate change, for instance, when people my son's age encounter satire, when they encounter climate fiction as an emerging genre, you guys maybe have heard of it, cli-fi is something that's coming out. These kinds of narratives that are satirical and sort of poking fun at climate deniers and climate obstructionists and the fact that we have so much inertia, they are really able to understand the unfairness and the sense of overweening power that these industrial forces have, and are able to talk back to it. So that's where I'm sitting these days, thinking increasingly about how we can all be climate communicators by thinking more carefully about what is really going on, enjoying that having that healthy cynicism, and trying to just overcome it.
Terrific. That's a great answer. Thanks, Melissa. And Timmons, over to you.
Well, I would build on Melissa and just say that the old people need to get out of the way. That is, I'm an old person, but I just feel like the older generation is really pretty clueless and honestly quite selfish about what they're leaving for the next generation. I know that's harsh, but that's what I think of when my students talk to me about their understanding of why we're not dealing with climate change. So, when I thought of your question, I thought, one of the things is to just address the disinformation directly, and especially to tell people where the upstream faucet of disinformation comes from. And what we found in the case of this, for example, the offshore wind attacks in the United States, is that they're coming from right-wing think tanks and public relations firms who are funded by the fossil fuel industry very quietly, often through dark money channels. But if people understand where the information's coming from, sometimes they get mad about that, and people don't like to be lied to. So I think that, can turn some people into climate pioneers when they just feel like they've been lied to, and that their world is being trashed for somebody else's benefit, not their own. So people need to also talk about, they need to be reassured that it's not going to bust the economy acting on climate, and that it's going to be reasonable cost to do so. So that's coming up increasingly here in the U.S. And locally as well, that utility bills went skyrocketing this year. Price of natural gas is high, but people need to understand, that this is actually, if you look at a broader range of costs and so on, it's actually cheaper to act on climate.
Yep.
But in the end, really, it's about politics. That is, I think, environmentalists, climate pioneers need to become politically active and start doing things like supporting candidates and running for office, but especially engaging in the political process, or they've just, and it's not just, with good ideas, but you got to get kind of down and dirty and do things like create political action committees and donate to, in ways that will create real political power.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I mean, it is true that getting action on climate change, sure, it can be partly about how you shop, for example, but really how you vote. That's kind of an absolutely crucial thing. Okay, so when I think of climate action liars and blockers, one very powerful group that comes to mind is the Murdoch Empire, which includes News Corp. I think it's had an extremely corrosive impact in Australia, the US and the UK. And so I'm going to ask each of you whether you share that view and how significant an impact you think News Corp has had. So I'll come back to you, Timmons, first on that one. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think you guys over in Australia might know Murdoch a little better, but we do know Fox News over here in the U.S., and it's been devastating on climate change. There's just endless anti-climate action distortion. That is, for example, showing pictures of whales claiming that they were killed by wind turbines, when we basically, don't have any turbines. We're just putting them up, and many of the whales were killed, and before there was turbines and so on. It's endless, and they just don't seem to care. They're just, in the pocket of somehow this oil and gas. They're serving that interest. And I would say the Wall Street Journal's editorial office and some other Murdoch outlets have been terrible. So I'll leave this one to Melissa and John.
Okay, Melissa, because we're kind of on your turf here, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, as Timmons said, we know that News Corp is just one of the largest, one of the most politically influential media systems ever. And what News Corp does matters because it has such extensive influence, especially in Australia's media market, but of course, as you say, also in the US and the UK. And the Murdoch media outlets have denied the science of climate change and ridiculed climate action for at least 15 years. And one other thing I have really been interested by is how News Corp itself has intentionally undermined decarbonization and helped to displace political leaders who have advocated for climate action. So I think one thing that this teaches us is that these media systems are not purely, it's not just about the messaging. It's very much a structural problem where, again, you have these businesses that are so powerful that they really can extend tentacles into political life, into financial life, into how industries act and shape the outcomes. And that's incredibly devastating to have news or so-called news organizations that have really just blindsided their consumers when it comes to climate change.
Yes, that rings depressingly true to those of us in Australia, which brings me to you, John. What are your thoughts on this?
I'll give you a personal anecdote, which I think illustrates the challenge of Murdoch media. At the beginning, we talked about how I published a study finding 97% consensus on climate change. And then there was a lot of criticism from climate deniers trying to undermine or discredit the research. A lot of that criticism came from conservative newspapers. And I developed a strategy where whenever a conservative newspaper published an op-ed attacking my work, I would email the editor requesting a right of reply in the same section. And I figured that would be a way to at least get some factual information that conservative readers would not normally be exposed to, and even try to inoculate them against the techniques of misinformation that were being used against my study. Now, in Australia, the national newspaper is called The Australian, and it's a Murdoch newspaper. And after our study was published, they published an op-ed in the Weekend Australian attacking my 97% consensus study. And so I requested a right of reply, and the editor agreed, which surprised me. And I was a bit like the dog chasing a car that had suddenly caught it. And so I wrote my response debunking the original article, sent it off, and then the Weekend Australian came out. And if you open up this big newspaper and looked at it, you saw my article in the middle of the page, and then surrounding it were like 3 different articles written by climate deniers, all attacking the consensus.
Right.
So they had, and these were by fairly leading climate deniers. So they'd obviously scrambled and mobilized some of their leading voices to write articles in response to my article. And it was really going into enemy territory, and it was like an away game in sports. So,
so you were literally surrounded by the skeptics, John.
Exactly.
By the denialists.
That tells you really one of the challenges of Murdoch media and conservative media is that the readers or consumers of this media, whether it's Fox News or conservative newspapers or whatever, they're just bombarded with misinformation, and any facts that might squeeze through are surrounded by all this other misinformation. And that makes it a real challenge, because if we as scientists or climate communicators are trying to get our information out there, we're pushing against this fire hose of falsehoods, that's just a structural challenge
Yes.
from a communication point of view.
Yes, well, I agree with all of you. And in fact, as you know, there are sort of loose negotiating alliances in UN climate talks. For example, Australia and the US are both in a group which has the unlikely name of the umbrella group. And I often think that we need to recognize another grouping, which I call the Misters because of the first letters of their names, namely the Murdoch Empire, Russia and Saudi Arabia, or MRS, because personally, I think these three powerful entities all have the common shared goal of undermining all efforts to take meaningful action on climate change. We are fast running out of time, so there's a lot more questions I was hoping to ask, but I'm going to stick with two more. And one of them, no offense, but you've all been a bit of a downer. So as we head towards the end of the podcast, tell me something upbeat about climate communication and dismantling obstructionist narratives. Tell me how they can be neutralized or at least widely recognized for what they are. So Melissa, over to you first.
Well, I gave a talk a year or two ago to a large group of nonprofit communicators. So communicators who work in NGOs and nonprofits about what we can do about climate change. As you say, try to have a more hopeful attitude rather than a more critical or cynical attitude. And one of the things I really tried to get across is that it really doesn't matter what our job title is or our role in our professional lives. I think we are actually all climate communicators, because we now live in a world that demands that we put climate change at the center of everything that we do. And to the extent that all problems are, in their own way, climate-related problems, we can see how it connects to our lives directly and how to have conversations about it. I think this is something John touched on earlier in this episode. Climate change is at the heart of international issues. It's at the heart of local issues. It's tied to the big questions of justice and equality, but it's also tied to very small issues of individual decision-making. And yet, climate change has a kind of branding problem. It's not fundamentally a political issue, climate change, but it has become a deeply politicized conversation. And our media, especially social media, thrives on polarization. It's almost like a seedbed for these highly charged, very emotional, strong opinions, quick takes, and outrage style of conversation. So I think one of the challenges we have, but one of the opportunities we have, is that we can show people that we're all together in this reality, that we actually have incredible common ground when it comes to our values and our preferences around climate change. I do think at some level we do actually all want the same thing. I know that seems maybe naive or hard to imagine at this stage, but I do like to think that there are ways of finding common ground, and that if we imagine ourselves as always having climate change at the center of our thinking, that we can work together to derive some solutions.
Terrific. That's a great answer. Thanks so much. Timmons, over to you. Flip yourself to glass half full mode and tell me something upbeat about climate communication and dismantling obstructionist narratives.
Yeah, Murray, in the introduction to the book, which I hope people will look at, we have this whole section on who is seeking to address obstruction and how. And we have sections on policymakers and lawyers. And so I think, following up on what Melissa just said, this is kind of some explicit examples from around the world on what's being done in terms of lawsuits and government investigations, efforts in the UN negotiations, and on and on. a whole section on NGOs and activists, which of course would be my suggestion to everyone, that don't try to solve this problem alone. You need to be part of an organization and be supporting organizations that are actively acting on climate. So again, the naming and shaming, using direct lobbying, employing strategies operating outside the confines of existing institutions, campaigns and protests that involve rallies, civil disobedience, site of occupations, and so on. There's also a part on journalists. Journalists are a huge part of this story. A lot of what we know is due to the hard work of investigative journalists. And, hopefully some other, press outlets will stop taking money from and stop doing this, what is sort of branded, what do they call this, Melissa?
Branded content.
Branded content, right.
Yeah.
Stop taking money from the worst of the obstructors. And then scholars and students and businesses. So we have lots to be done. There is lots to be done. And again, we need people of all types. There is space in this effort for anyone with any skills or no skills. So I'll just leave it there.
Terrific. That's a great answer too. And John, bring us home on this question. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm glad you're finishing with this positive note, because during this whole conversation, I have been thinking, man, this sounds depressing. All this stuff that we're talking about.
I should just play a Leonard Cohen song as the intro and outro. But yeah, go on.
It's kind of an issue with academia that we tend to spend more of our research time diagnosing the problem than coming up with solutions. And so I've really tried to spend most of my research designing, testing, and deploying interventions to try to solve climate misinformation. And I've happened upon it actually during my PhD as well, inoculation theory as a quite an effective strategy for neutralizing misinformation. Inoculation theory basically being that we can inoculate people against misinformation by explaining how misinformation misleads. So that can either be explaining the rhetorical techniques used, or as Timmons mentioned earlier, talking about the upstream sources of misinformation can also help inoculate people against misinformation. And that can do two things. One, it can build people's immunity against being misled. But more importantly, there's this interesting concept in the psychological research called post-inoculation talk, which means that when you inoculate people, they're also more likely to talk about the issue with their friends and family. And that's really important with climate change. It is about empowering and activating people. Ultimately, to solve climate change, as Timmons mentioned, I think he said it was in the introduction of the volume, we need collective action. That's really one of the key things. Individual actions matter, but ultimately collective action is what we need to really get that kind of societal transformation that we need to adequately solve climate change. And I guess that's the hopeful thing. Collective action does work. We have historical precedents where collective action has changed society and solved these kinds of challenges. And so I think we do have hope there.
Yeah, terrific. Okay, and my final question, which is a standard question I ask all guests, and it's this. Tell me one fact or insight that you wish was more widely understood, because it would help us deliver faster progress towards a cleaner, greener, better world. And Timmons, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, Murray, thanks for having us on to talk about the book, because my message is really that I wish people seeking to advance climate action would understand better their opposition, and that would allow them to be much more strategic in planning for it. And as John says, things like pre-bunking and really building a more resilient strategy to fight for what we know is so desperately needed. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And over to you, Melissa.
Yes, my takeaway, or the one thing that I really spend a lot of time thinking about and that I want to share with your listeners, is that a lot of debate, so-called debate about the climate crisis, or arguments and opposing sides. A lot of those debates have been about who is right, who holds the truth about the scientific reality of climate change. The geographer Mike Hulme at Cambridge has spoken about this. But often the ongoing disputes are not about climate change at all, about climate science. They're about values. They're about perspectives and political preferences. And as sort of maybe as Timmons pointed out, if I could just join in his approach, I think those who are trying to obstruct policy conversations about climate change are very good at couching the problem in values and in political preferences. Yeah. And this activates people to displace the existential problem and instead focus on shorter term concerns about their lifestyles or their purchasing habits or what have you. So I really want to encourage people to listen with a critical ear when someone is saying to you, oh, your comforts will be taken away. You won't be able to do these fun things that you always thought you could do if you attend to the climate crisis. What is really being asked of us, and how can we respond in a way that builds this collective action we've been talking about and doesn't give more and more oxygen to climate deniers and their various forms of obstruction?
Yeah. Okay. Great answer. And John, once again, bring us home.
I'm going to risk the fallacy of oversimplification, which is something I warn against in some of my research.
Oh, yeah.
If I was in an elevator and I had 3 flights to tell someone one thing about climate change, what I would probably say is that the most important thing that they can do to contribute to climate change, to help solve climate change, is just open their mouth and talk about it with their friends and family, with anyone. They don't have to be an expert. They don't have to know all the climate science or all the policy details. It can just be a matter of just explaining why they care about the issue, sharing their values, as Melissa was saying. And that sends a social signal as well as potentially giving people information. But most importantly, it builds on that social momentum that we need for climate progress.
Terrific. Melissa, Timmons, John, thanks so much.
Thank you, Murray.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that chat. The climate obstructionists aren't in a majority, except in social media comments and in the Murdoch media. But they're definitely getting louder, and they've got a lot of money behind them. That means we can't just leave it to others to rebut misinformation or to praise climate action wins. We all have a role to play. And just a reminder, if you want to get a copy of the book, Climate Obstruction, A Global Assessment, it's available from Oxford University Press. See you next time.